Hello, I'm Emily Rhodes, and today I'm going to be chatting to you a little bit about Persuasion by Jane Austen. Um, yes, this is the July pick for Emily's Walking Book Club. At last, you must be thinking, if you're one of the many, many readers and walkers who've been asking me for years, please can we do a Jane Austen? This is your moment. It's of course the 250th anniversary of Jane Austen, and it's also the 150th Emily's Walking Book Club book, which is kind of astonishing. Really, I suppose we should be having a party to celebrate, but instead, of course, we'll have a walk and a great book. So, Persuasion, I know, is, of course, it was Austen's last book. It's seen by many readers to be her best. I think the jury's out. I don't know, I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that. It is about, in a nutshell, in case you haven't read it or watched the film or whatever else, if you don't know the story, it begins with Anne Elliot and her family. Anne Elliot, we know, is 27, and there's quite a lot in this book about age. She's much older than Austen's typical heroines, the sort of Lizzie Bennets and so on. And we get this glimpse back. We're told that when she was, of that Lizzie Bennet age, 19 or 20 or however old she is, 8 years ago, she was in love with a Mr. Wentworth who went off to go into the Navy, and she was persuaded by her kind of well-meaning, is it her aunt or, some sort of important woman, because her mother is dead, sadly, not to marry him because she feels he doesn't have enough position. And classic, 8 years on, when we're with Anne this time, Wentworth, the man, went off into the Navy. This is a great celebration of the Navy, this book. There's really this feeling of going into the Navy, you're going to be incredibly brave and make your fortune. Wentworth comes back a sort of rich and great man and a very desirable match. But Anne, still rather longs for him and, was, poor her, really, to be persuaded not to marry him, to turn him down. So that's the kind of setup. There's also her father, who's very sort of vain and a bit sort of silly and frivolous with his money, has had to retrench himself. So they have to move out of their grand house and they go to Bath. And when we first really see Anne, there are these options as to where they're going to go. They have to move out of their house because of all his debts. And there are sort of three alternatives: London, Bath, or another house in the country. And all Anne's wishes had been for the latter. She loves being in the country. She wants to be a Lady Russell, even though she was the lady who persuaded her. And then we learn, but the usual fate of Anne attended her in having something very opposite from her inclination fixed on. She disliked Bath and did not think it agreed with her, and Bath was to be her home. So we learn immediately that it is Anne's usual fate for, what she doesn't want, she has to make her peace with. That's what happens to her. Anyway, before she goes off to Bath, she goes and stays with her sister, who is another quite brilliant, sort of annoying character who's always complaining about things. While she's with her, she spends some time with the Musgroves, the family of the man her sister has married. And while she's there, who shows up but Captain Wentworth? And it kind of looks as though he's going to go with, get together with Louisa, Anne's sister-in-law. But then they all go off to Lyme, and Louisa jumps and the captain doesn't catch her, and she ends up with Benwick instead, and the captain then comes to Bath, and blah 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 blah. Finally they kind of begin to get together and it's all okay, and there are various other complications thrown into the mix, such as the kind of conniving Mr. Elliot and Lady Dalrymple, all this other stuff, but that's the sort of core of what happens. So on rereading this, I've really been thinking a lot about Anne as a character. Obviously now, when we think of a 27-year-old, we think of them as being very young. But in Jane Austen's day, that was like positively ancient. You were really on the shelf. I suppose you were probably, it was a bit like being my age now, 41, maybe even older. And I suppose reading this, I wanted really to relate to Anne as a kind of more mature protagonist, heroine. But I really felt, to be totally honest, and please don't be cross with me for saying this, I felt that I couldn't relate to her. And I think the reason I found her so frustrating is because she doesn't say anything. She's always just listening. And we do get these glimpses of actually her being very capable of action and absolutely brilliant in a crisis. We see when her nephew has that bad fall, the little boy, and and Anne is so good at looking after him and has the presence of mind to kind of calm down her sister and get the apothecary and nurse him. And that's like a prefiguring of what happens when Louisa has that jump in Lyme and Wentworth doesn't catch her, and it's this terrible moment where she's lying kind of lifeless on the floor. And really, when you're reading the book, you're sort of jolted with shock and horror, and everyone either sort of flaps or freezes except for Anne, who is like, no, this is what we need to do. And she has the presence of mind to get Benwick, who is living there, to go and find the surgeon, because he will find the surgeon quicker. So we really see that Anne is fantastic in a crisis. And I have to say, I think this is another way that I couldn't relate to her, because I don't think I am very good in a crisis. I normally am the sort of flappy one. Hopefully that isn't tested too much. But during the book, I think Austen really charts Anne's journey from being someone who is persuaded. We learn that her usual fate is to end up doing what she doesn't really want to do, of being somebody who doesn't really speak up, somebody who listens. And it's only really at the end, in Bath, when Wentworth and her are in Bath together, that Anne starts to speak. And that is really where she kind of finds her voice and grows into herself and, gets the happy ending she deserves. So by the end, I was with Anne, but maybe rather brilliantly, I feel like I'm already able to speak. However, I think on rereading this book, I have come to appreciate just how many benefits there are to listening as well as speaking. And I thought I would just read a few bits out to try and show this journey from Anne being a listener to Anne being a speaker, and see what we can kind of get from that. So we've already learned, read the bit about it being her usual fate. I think, and somewhere it says, she's a most attentive listener. And then she goes off to Uppercross to stay with her sister after they move out of the house. This is before she goes on to Bath. So she's spending this time with her sister. And this is really where we see Anne listening to everyone, all the other characters there. Austen actually gives them this kind of direct speech. We see, the speech marks, we hear their voice, and they were all grumbling to Anne about the other characters. And it's quite funny because, it's that classic thing. They've all got different they've all got their own different take on the situation, on, you know, why so and so is behaving badly, or what behaviour is good and what isn't, and it's all completely contrasting with one another. And we learn that Anne, you know, so we have these pages and pages of Mary's declaration was this, and you know, actually quite a lot of them are from Mary, and Charles, in fact, that's Mary's husband, says this, or you know, one of the sisters says this, that. Then Austen says, how was Anne to set all these matters to rights? She could do little more than listen patiently, soften every grievance, and excuse each to the other. Give them all hints of the forbearance necessary between such near neighbours, and make those hints broadest, which were meant for her sister's benefit. It's quite funny. You definitely wouldn't want to hint anything too strongly to Mary. So really she can do little more than listen, soften and hint. And I think I would find that extremely frustrating, and I actually think it's something I can relate to, that feeling of frustration where the situation isn't quite right, and you want very much to make things better, but you can't. But of course, as we all know, being listened to does have its benefits in and of itself. You know, actually just giving someone a chance to speak and to listen to them is helping them. So Anne actually is being helpful. Even if you're a speaker, it's quite annoying to not be able to do anything. Anyway, there's then this sort of interesting moment when, so anyway, she keeps on listening, and actually you get this feeling that she's such a good listener. She's got such a fine ear, and there's that moment when Wentworth kind of comes back into their lives, and she, you know, a few pages on, it's interesting, and you know how Anne first interacts with him. You know, she's been having her breakfast. So much is about what Anne can hear. She says, her eye half met Captain Wentworth's, a bow, a curtsy passed. She heard his voice. He talked to Mary, said all that was right, said something to the Miss Musgroves, enough to mark an easy footing. The room seemed full of persons and voices, but a few minutes ended it. Charles showed himself at the window, all was ready, their visitor had bowed and was gone. And she says, it's over, she repeated to herself again and again in nervous gratitude, the worst is over. So this encounter, the first time she's seen this man who she loved in 8 years, it's so much about hearing his voice, straining to hear what he's saying. You know, she can hear him talking to Mary. He said something to the Miss Musgroves. You know, Austen, of course, knows what Captain Wentworth said, but she's showing us what Anne can hear. Anne can't hear what he says, just something. And then she longs to know what he made of her, and it's when Mary comes back from being with him, we hear Mary say, Henrietta asked him what he thought of you when they went away, and he said, you were so altered he should not have known you again. And we learn that Anne fully submitted in silent, deep mortification. Doubtless it was so, and she could take no revenge, for he was not altered, or not for the worse. And there's this brilliant irony here, isn't it? You know, of course, she hears these words haunt her, this idea that she is altered in her appearance. You know, she's so diminished by the sadness, the pining for him. But of course, she's also unaltered in her feelings. She may be altered in appearance and, you know, the passing of time, but she is unaltered. And there is a wonderful moment near the end when she hears Wentworth say that she has not altered, and the word kind of catches in her ear, and she remembers what he is said to have said before, and decides to forgive him this change, knowing that, that this is the sign that he really has allowed himself to love her again. He no longer sees her alteration, he just sees her as the same, constant. Anyway, here she is listening and listening and listening. There's a great moment when she's in Bath and has this walk. So yeah, this is quite a lot later in the book. Again, I'm just trying to remember where exactly this is. So there, she's suddenly seen Wentworth again, the first time since Lyme. So she's in Bath, Wentworth comes in, they have this sort of slightly awkward conversation, then Mr. Elliot comes, and Wentworth is in fact jealous of Mr. Elliot, and Mr. Elliot and Anne go off and walk. He walks her home, and we learn Anne would have been particularly obliged to her cousin, that's Mr. Elliot, if he would have walked by her side all the way to Camden Place without saying a word. She had never found it so difficult to listen to him. Though nothing could exceed his solicitude and care, and though his subjects were principally such as were wont to be always interesting, praise, warm, just and discriminating of Lady Russell, and insinuations highly rational against Mrs. Clay, but just now she could think only of Captain Wentworth. She could not understand his present feelings, whether he were really suffering much from disappointment or not. Until that point was settled, she could not be quite herself. So her thoughts are so preoccupied with Captain Wentworth that she cannot be enough of herself to be a good listener. She can't listen, she's thinking about something else. I mean, surely we are all familiar with this. When you're trying to listen to someone and your thoughts are sort of muddling off on something else. And I think that is probably what makes me such a bad listener, is I'm often got a million different things going through my head. And I think this, interestingly, this bit really made me think, God, actually it is so important sometimes to just listen carefully, to be, I suppose, to be fully present with someone, to not have your mind drifting off thinking about someone else, but really to be there with them. And like Anne, you cannot listen to someone unless you are truly there with them in your mind as well as your physical presence. So I feel that was quite a good lesson for me. And then there's this brilliant moment when they go to the assembly rooms, and in he comes. They're all going to see this concert, and they're there. Oh, I do actually love this bit. She's there, Anne's there with her father and Mrs. Clay, and they all have to wait for this Lady Dalrymple. They took their station by one of the fires in the octagon room. But hardly were they so settled when the door opened again and Captain Wentworth walked in alone. Anne was the nearest to him, and making yet a little advance, she instantly spoke. And this is the moment, this is the first time really that we see her instantly speak. Until this point, she's always been watching or listening. And when she hears something that she can't handle, she just leaves the room. When we first hear mention of Wentworth, back when they're deciding whether to go to Bath or London or wherever else, just the mention of his name makes her stand up and leave because she cannot bear to listen, to hear him. Then she copes with listening, she copes with being with him. But here, on seeing him, she instantly spoke. And then we see he was preparing only to bow and pass on, but her gentle "how do you do," so we get these speech marks, so we actually get her speech, brought him out of the straight line to stand near her and make inquiries in return, in spite of the formidable father and sister in the background. So they're sort of snubbing him because they're so snobby. So it is this sign of action, her being able to speak instantly creates change. It changes Wentworth's behaviour. It makes him speak back to her, and this is the beginning of them. It literally enables them to stand next to each other, to be together. Of course, his big outpouring to her comes in the form of a letter, which he does begin by saying, I can listen no longer in silence. I must speak to you by such means as are within my reach. He also wants to speak, but he feels he cannot speak. He has to write it in a letter instead. But he asks for her. At the end of his letter, he says, I must go, uncertain of my fate, but I shall return hither or follow your party as soon as possible. A word, a look, will be enough to decide whether I enter your father's house this evening or never. He asks her for a word in return. And then I think there's this sort of lovely trick that Austen plays on us towards the end when they finally do speak to each other. She gives him this word, and very soon after this letter, and what's brilliant is that, having been actually very involved in this direct speech, and so sorry, just missed a page here. So, Anne leaves and her brother kind of starts escorting her home. And we get this conversation between her and her brother. We get it all in direct speech as they were there listening. Austen is letting us listen. And then they meet Captain Wentworth, and Charles said, Captain Wentworth, which way are you going? And he says, I hardly know. Are you going? So we get this conversation, real reported conversation. And then Austen kind of scans out, and she changes the way she writes to report their speech. And she says, soon words enough had passed between them to decide their direction towards the comparatively quiet and retired gravel walk, where the power of conversation would make the present hour a blessing indeed, and prepare for it all the immortality which the happiest recollections of their own future lives could bestow. There they exchanged again those feelings and those promises which had once before seemed to secure everything, but which had been followed by so many, many years of division and estrangement. There they returned again into the past, most exquisitely happy perhaps in their she's saying what happens, and she's saying, she had not mistaken him, this had happened, this was that. She's not letting us listen to them have this conversation. She's saying this was like the ultimate conversation, the reward, this is the great moment. And she really, there are little bits, little snippets, but so little is told to us. It's as though she's saying this is just for them. This is their moment. This is their private speech. This is not for us, the readers, to listen to. It's sort of sacred to them. And I have to say, I feel good on you, Anne. You deserve it. I will let you have that special conversation. I won't eavesdrop. And yes, it's a sort of wonderful irony, really. Anyway, I think there's so much in this book about speaking and listening and, speaking through a letter, overhearing. There are those moments where you can kind of see, where the characters can see things but not hear them. It's fascinating. Anyway, it certainly made me who I think I am quite a natural, as you can see, bit of a natterer. I think it has made me it's inspired me to really hone my listening skills as well. And, hopefully when we do go on our walks and talk about books, I think one of the reasons the walks work so well is because we're all thinking so hard about the book, that we really are there on that walk, thinking about the book, listening to what the other person who we're walking with is saying, rather than our thoughts drifting all over the place. Certainly not. Well, maybe in this case we will be thinking about Captain Wentworth. Anyway, thank you for joining. And before I end, you've lasted this long. I'm just going to give you a little glimpse of the September book. I'm going to do it very fast. All to be announced fully soon.